What if the secret to creating inclusion wasn't bringing everyone together to be comfortable? What if the secret to creating inclusion was to bring everyone together to collide? I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because we're going to be talking about collision theory and employee resource groups. Collision what? Collision theory and employee resource groups. I know sometimes it sounds as if I make this stuff up, but I don't. Every week we inform and educate using applied research and thought leadership, and this week is no exception. I know I said collision theory and employee resource groups, but let's start by talking about employee resource groups and then we'll come back to the collision theory. One of the go-to ways that organizations try to foster diversity and inclusion is to create communities. Nowadays, it's almost taken for granted that it leads to inclusion, which of course it doesn't unless you do it properly. There's multiple ways of building communities, but let's talk about employee resource groups, staff networks, business resource groups, whatever you call them, you know what I'm talking about. Here, we define them as voluntary groups of employees that share the same interests, the same values, or the same social identity. For the most part, resource groups are underutilized in most organizations. I always describe them like websites in the year 2000. For those of you who can remember, in the year 2000, a lot of people had a website, but not everyone knew how to use them properly. Fast forward to today, can you imagine any credible business that didn't have a website? That's how I feel about employee resource groups. And I've spent a lot of time explaining how to enhance your resource groups. I've got dozens of episodes of the podcast on this topic alone. This podcast used to be called the Resource Groups Podcast. That's how important I think they are. In my PhD, a third of it was about employee resource groups. I even developed a framework. I've refined it and I've tested it on organizations all over the world. As a regular listener, you know that I'm part of a small community of people who are doing research in this space. This time last year, I was in Boston. I was in the USA with some of the leading researchers in this space. And if you're talking about research, if you're talking about employee resource groups, then you really should be talking about Teresa Wellborn. Professor Teresa Wellborn is without question a leading scholar when it comes to employee resource groups in organizations. And I've been trying to get her on the show for years. Every time we get together, we end up talking and not recording anything. And I know you're thinking, well, why should that stop us? Well, to be honest, every person I've interviewed on the podcast has been a face-to-face interview. Personally, I find that it gives it a completely different energy. And speaking of energy, this brings us to collision theory. In chemistry, collision theory states that molecules must collide to get a reaction. But it takes energy to get the molecules to collide. Okay, so what's that got to do with inclusion? Well, Professor Wellborn has borrowed that idea and applied it to creating inclusion in the workplace. It goes something like this. In order to create an inclusive workplace, we need people to change the way they think. But in particular, we need to change the way people behave. To change a person's behavior, a person needs to come to their own realization that their behavior needs to change. Professor Wellborn argues that those moments of realization come from collisions. So what is a collision? These are described as personal experiences that an individual has when they meet, work, or interact with someone who's new. Someone who that person would think of as being different from themselves. The whole argument is having meaningful contact with people who are different can be good for business, but it can also be good for individuals. Now you're hearing all of this and thinking, yeah, I already knew that. And you may even be thinking that the word collision, it doesn't sound like a positive thing. It sounds like conflict, disagreement, discord. It doesn't sound good. And that's because you're not focusing on the energy that I mentioned. My understanding is that the energy may be a cause and effect of the collision. What do I mean? Well, Professor Wellborn's research shows that resource groups give people confidence. They help people to develop as leaders, but they also boost the energy of individual members compared to people who aren't members. So why does this energy matter? As an input, the energy is deemed to be essential. It's what allows you to successfully handle individual collisions with people who are different to you. As an output, the hypothesis is that collisions release energy, and it's the ability to use that energy to work together to create something bigger than themselves that helps organizations to meet their inclusion goals. The energy makes the difference. The resource groups makes the difference. And let me be clear about this. At the time I'm recording, this is a work in progress. That's why I said hypothesis, but I wanted to share it with you because of my recent conversations with the professor. This is something that you should be thinking about now. How can you leverage your employee resource groups? How can you create energy in those groups to develop, to embed inclusion in your organization? And let's be clear as well. Energy can be unstable. It needs to be managed appropriately. We know this. Think about how many leaders are afraid of getting it wrong because they don't know what to say. They also don't want to see the momentum that is building turned against them. Bursts of energy can cause catastrophe or advancement. My point is, you don't have to do it alone. Why not use your employee resource groups to help you? Think about it. We're saying that collisions are related to people who are different. But most people who join ERGs, they do it so that they can be around people similar to themselves. I know this from my own research and work with my own clients. What if you used your groups to promote collisions? What if you used your groups to promote meaningful exchanges with people who aren't similar, people who are different? That could change everything for you. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? 1. Employee resource groups increase energy in individual members. 2. That energy can be used to create collisions. And 3. Collisions may lead to changes in behavior and release more energy. So what do you think? How can you test collision theory where you work? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, then give us a review on iTunes. It helps other people like you to find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.